The second generation 3-liter TDI is essentially not a bad engine because with proper regular maintenance it can last more than 500,000 kilometers. But since it is a more complex newer generation diesel engine, you have to expect some more and less expensive issues and a big amount of annoying oil and coolant leaks. You can find this engine in many different cars ranging from a 4th generation Audi A4 through an A8 D4 to the 2nd generation VW Touareg or Porsche Cayenne, or even in a 1st generation Porsche Panamera. Before I move on to the issues, I have to mention that some of these cars like the A6 or the A7 for example can be equipped with also the newer, updated version of this engine. I will call this updated version a 3rd generation 3-liter TDI. This 3rd generation can have some more hilarious issues and I would not recommend it, unless it's under warranty. The most noticeable visual difference between the 2nd and 3rd generation is that the crankshaft pulley in the 3rd generation has only one bolt. Plus the intake manifold looks a bit different as well. I'm not gonna talk about this 3rd generation engine any further, so forget about it. Let's focus on the 2nd generation only. The injectors themselves can get faulty after approximately 200,000 kilometers and the injector washers can start to leak, but I will come back to these topics at the end of the video. Another issue related to the injectors are the injector bolts, which can simply get loose or even break. In this case the injector will pop out, which you will definitely notice because of the various symptoms. The high pressure fuel pump in these engines is a Bosch CP4 pump, which will mechanically fail at some point, releasing tiny metal particles which will destroy all the injectors. It can rarely fail before 200,000 kilometers, but usually just after this mileage point or just after 400,000 kilometers. The turbocharger mounted on top of the engine will fail at some point as well, but mostly just in higher mileage cars. The crankshaft pulley at the front will fall apart sooner or later, causing the accessory belt to jump off the same way as on the older 3-liter engines. So if the pulley looks worn or rusty, then it's better to replace it preventively. Next there are the leaks. And let me tell you, this engine was literally made to leak oil and coolant. So let's start with the list. The gaskets of the oil cooler and the gaskets of the oil cooler base plate, located between the cylinder heads, can leak. Behind the oil cooler there is a small plastic coolant flange. The two O-rings on this flange can obviously leak coolant, but since the flange itself is made from plastic, it will eventually crack and leak as well, because it's garbage. Behind the coolant flange there is a plastic coolant regulating valve. This part can also leak coolant either because of the O-ring, but also because it's a piece of plastic garbage which will eventually crack. Then, in front of the oil cooler, there is this magnificent piece of engineering. This is a plastic coolant cover which is mounted onto the main front engine cover. The big front engine cover is surprisingly metallic, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is that this small coolant cover also has a gasket which will leak. But since the cover itself is made from plastic, it will eventually crack and leak coolant as well, because it's garbage. To top of that, the only way to remove this small plastic coolant cover is to remove the whole big front cover of the engine, which is not an easy nor a quick job. Plus, during this, you will have to replace the gasket of this big front engine cover as well. Next there is the oil filter housing, which also contains the main thermostat. As usual, the two gaskets of this housing can leak, but since it's made entirely from plastic, be ready that the housing itself eventually cracks and start to leak. And obviously, if it cracks, then you will have to replace the whole housing, because it's garbage. Then, it's good to know that this engine also has a separate oil thermostat, which is inserted into the engine block through this hole under the water pump. The O-ring of the small cover of this oil thermostat can leak oil, so don't be surprised about this. While you are gonna fix these leaks, You should also preventively replace this coolant pipe on top of the engine, which is located in front of the turbocharger. This pipe is made entirely from plastic as well, and eventually it will crack and leak coolant. Because it's garbage! Next, the rear main seal can leak oil, and the rear timing chain covers, which are sealed with sealant from the factory, are gonna slowly leak oil on older or high mileage cars. The valve cover gaskets can leak too, but who cares at this point? Let's move on to the timing chain. Unlike the first generation 3-liter TDI, this newer engine is equipped with a redesigned, simpler timing chain mechanism. Despite the fact that it's redesigned and simpler, it can still get worn and sometimes even prematurely. Mainly in cars made to 2013, the chain can start to rattle before 200,000 kilometers and sometimes even before 100,000 kilometers because of the early weaker chain tensioner. Cars made from the end of 2013 should have an updated chain tensioner fitted, so in these newer models the chain should not rattle that early. Interestingly, plenty of people and even mechanics are gonna tell you that a short rattle in these engines after startup is fine. Well, there is a bit of truth in this, since the chain failures on these engines causing catastrophic damage are not very common. However, I have to add that if you hear a chain rattle at startup, then there is a chance that the chain jumps and causes engine damage, mainly if it's too loose. The problem is that you simply don't know how loose the chain is without inspecting it directly. For example, in this case, the chain mechanism is too loose, as you can see, and it should be definitely replaced. So a chain rattle is definitely not a normal condition. On the other side, it's also possible that the chain mechanism lasts more than 300,000 kilometers even with a short rattle. But at around this mileage point, it's a good idea to replace the chain mechanism preventively, even if it's not rattling, because the tensioners and the plastic guides are gonna be worn to some extent. The plastic guides can even break, plus on high mileage cars the chains will stretch as well. Lastly, there are a couple of last things related to these engines. So, occasionally various sensor failures can occur. Occasionally issues with the EGR valve or with the throttle body actuator can occur too. The vacuum solenoid on top of the engine can fail, and this is interesting, since in this case you can usually experience that the coolant won't reach operating temperature or fluctuating coolant temperature. Then keep in mind that cars which have the Dieselgate software update can experience various issues. And lastly, it's good to know that these engines have a variable oil pump with two pressure stages regulated by this pressure regulating valve. This valve is located on the front lower part of the engine, so it's easy to see and access it. It can sometimes fail, so it's a good idea to replace this valve preventively after 200,000 kilometers because it's not that expensive. Before I move on to the last topics, I have to mention that mainly in the heavy SUVs, these engines are a bit more prone to leaking head gasket or cracked cylinder head. So pay attention to the various early and late signs of these issues. And before buying, check mainly the coolant. It has to be clean, topped up, without any oil traces or oil smell. However, I have to add that this is not a very common problem, so there is no need to panic. But try to not abuse these engines. To end this video, I will briefly talk about the injectors, DPF filter and a mysterious coolant loss, since all of these things are related to all these diesel engines. First, the injectors. The injectors will usually last at least approximately 200,000 kilometers, and in many cases even more than this, so they can somehow work even at 300,000 kilometers or 400,000 kilometers. However, be ready that they can fail after the already mentioned 200,000 kilometers. So at this mileage point it's good to at least remove them and have them tested. But if you want to be on the safe side, then you can also preventively replace all of them. The most common symptoms of badly working injectors are smoke from the exhaust at idle, or during acceleration. Slightly fluctuating idle, not good engine start, mainly with a warmed up engine, slightly higher fuel consumption will appear too, plus in this case the engine oil level can raise as well. But other symptoms can appear too, like a flashing glow plug light, check engine light, limp mode, injector related fault codes, and even a louder ticking, knocking noise from the faulty injectors. If you ignore any of these symptoms, then you are risking a major engine damage, which includes cracked or melted pistons and damaged cylinder walls. By the way, rarely the injectors can suddenly fail and start to leak excessive amount of fuel into the cylinder as well. This relatively rare phenomenon can easily end with a cracked or melted piston, which will damage the cylinder wall as well. To prolong the lifetime of the injectors, use good quality fuel, eventually good fuel additives, and replace the fuel filter regularly. Apart from the faulty injectors, you can experience leaking injector washers as well, but this issue can be easily and cheaply fixed. The symptoms of leaking injector washers are regular louder or not that loud hissing type noises from the engine, mostly at idle. Exhaust smell in the interior and in the engine compartment will appear as well. And if the leak is bigger, then you will also notice a black tar-like substance coming out from the injector vent holes on the cylinder heads above the exhaust manifolds. The black tar can end up on the exhaust manifolds or on the engine mount brackets, so it's easy to spot this. Next, there is the DPF. Most of these engines are equipped with a DPF filter. It can last even 500,000 kilometers, but bad injectors, incorrect engine oil, and using the car mainly on short distances are gonna reduce the lifetime of this filter significantly, since it gets clogged or even destroyed. By the way, if you are gonna use the car mainly for short distances, then the DPF will not burn off correctly. The result of this will be a rising oil level and later a clogged DPF. Some of the newer cars are equipped with the additional AdBlue emission system, which will have additional issues mainly in the older or high mileage cars, but I'm not gonna investigate this any further since nobody is paying me. Lastly, there is the mysterious coolant loss. All of these engines can rarely experience a mysterious coolant loss. If there is no external leak and the head gasket is fine together with the cylinder head, then this coolant loss is most probably caused by the EGR cooler, because rarely the EGR cooler can slightly crack internally, thus allowing the coolant to mix with the carbon soot in the cooler itself. Plus, it will slowly leak into the combustion chamber. This internal coolant leak is obviously not gonna help to extend the lifetime of the DPF filter, for example, so check the coolant level regularly and keep this in mind.